Well, while the New Zealand media continue their campaign for drugs and to legalise marijuana, yes, they're still trying. I'll show you some recent examples shortly. We continue to see highly alarming outcomes from legalising cannabis in US states, including spiralling addiction, psychotic illnesses, and hospitals facing a deluge of poisonings. Let's check it out. So remember the claims made by pro-drug activists in support of cannabis legalisation in New Zealand? According to the government, the Green Party, Drug Foundation, Helen Clark Foundation, Chloe Schwarbrick, we were supposed to believe that legalising recreational cannabis would lead to significant health benefits, reduced black market, no increasing usage, reduction in mental health issues, reduced crime, and so on. Thankfully, 51.2% of us weren't fooled into believing this. Just enough Kiwis to vote down the proposed cannabis legalisation bill. And there's continued mounting evidence refuting these pro-cannabis claims. Scientists overwhelmingly conclude that frequent use of the drug is not worth the risks. So here's 3 major studies that have just been released. Firstly, from Smart Approaches to Marijuana, also known as SAM, they report with regard to the first states that legalised marijuana in the US, Colorado, Washington, Alaska, and Oregon. And they say the National Survey on Drug Use and Health is the nation's premier survey that assesses the prevalence of substance use and substance use disorder. The prevalence of past month marijuana use amongst 18 to 25-year-olds has increased in the first 4 states that legalised recreational marijuana. Colorado and Washington legalised in 2012 and Alaska and Oregon in 2014. Now, past month use is significant as opposed to lifetime or just any time in the past year because it's indicative of more frequent, heavier use. Marijuana is also not legal for use until age 21, meaning many of these individuals are underage users. So you have frequent users, which is past month users, and then you have just one-off or very occasional dabble in it. Now, while 30 to 35% of 18 to 25-year-olds in the first states that legalised recreational marijuana were past month users in 2021 and 2022, this was closer to around 20% in the states that hadn't legalised marijuana. So, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Keeping the drug illegal keeps the usage down by this key age group, when the brain is still developing but the peer pressure is on. Probably don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out all this either. This trend is especially concerning for the 18 to 25-year-old demographic. Given that their brains are developing, the CDC warns the teen brain is actively developing and continues to develop until around age 25. Cannabis use during adolescence and young adulthood may harm the developing brain. So that's not good. Now, remember, New Zealand was going to make the age limit at 20, thinking that they could somehow prevent younger people increasing their usage. Yet, as you can see, in the US, it's 21, yet they're still having difficulties. It would have been worse for New Zealand. Now, the second study was reported in The Centrist last week, and it said this. Let me just get it. A new study published in JAMA Pediatrics analysed data from 355 women at Ohio State University Medical Center showing that children exposed to cannabis during pregnancy had poorer task-based planning ability and exhibited more observed aggression by age 5. These developmental impacts may hinder children's long-term academic success. Cannabis use in pregnancy, often turned to for relief from stress, nausea, or sleep issues, may have lasting implications. The lead researcher advised against it, despite cannabis being a natural product, due to its many risks. Keem noted our findings confirm and expand on long-standing evidence. Alongside cannabis, many participants were exposed to other substances, tobacco and alcohol, with many living below the poverty line. This added complexity to understanding cannabis's specific impact on child development. Another aspect of the study highlights additional physical risks. Pregnant women who use cannabis face a higher risk of conditions like pregnancy-induced hypertension, one study noting a 19% chance of placenta detachment. Research also links cannabis exposure to brain development issues in the prefrontal cortex, especially for learning. It is recommended that pregnant persons do not use cannabis, pregnant women, should say. Woke CDC. The CDC warned, reinforcing that THC, the hyperactive, psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, can pass through the mother to the baby, impacting their health across multiple areas. Once again, don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand that. Just because the baby is a separate human being, dependent on the mother and subject to her lifestyle, these decisions of the mother don't just affect the mother, they affect the other life. Now, one more. 2 weeks ago, and once again, thanks to our friends at SAM for reporting this, there was this study. A massive new study was published in one of the most prestigious journals in the pediatric world, the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, or JAMA. The study found that state legalisation of recreational marijuana increases the likelihood of marijuana use in the past month amongst youth and young adults. So this is similar to the first study we did, but it's also amongst youth as well as young adults. Past month use is a much clearer indication of frequent use and lifetime use or past year use. The systematic review was entitled Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis, Medical and Recreational Cannabis Legalisation and Cannabis Use Amongst Youth in the United States. It found that recreational marijuana legalisation increased the odds of past month marijuana use by 13% amongst youth and 22% amongst young adults. And this is a key point. This is not just one study saying that use goes up after legalisation. This is a systematic review of the publishing data on this topic. This study directly contradicts the marijuana industry talking point that legalisation does not increase youth use. And look, sorry, just one more. I said 3. There's actually 4, and it's relevant. You'll see why. According to the Minnesota Department of Health, from 2018 to 2023, the number of marijuana hospital-treated poisonings for children aged 4 and under increased by 733%. Wow. Cannabis is now legal for adults 21 and older to use and possess in Minnesota. The bill was signed into law on May 30. Now, Minnesota may be ringing a bell as to why we should be concerned about Minnesota. It's this one, Tim Walz, who was campaigning with Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris's running mate. Minnesota has been named by Walz as a haven for abortion and for transing children. And now it's also, unfortunately, got a very bad record for marijuana hospital-treated poisonings for children aged under 4, increased by 700% plus. I tell you what, it's a playground for the radical left, and families are suffering in that state. Now, what's happening in New Zealand? Well, the media continue to campaign for legalisation, very subtly, but very surely. Despite not being able to win the referendum in 2020. They're still sulking. And Derek Cheng at the New Zealand Herald is regularly writing about the issue. In fact, in our analysis of the media coverage of the cannabis referendum 4 years ago, he was one of the worst culprits in his coverage, with a 70-30 bias in favour of a yes vote from his 9 articles. But he was back this week, and he was saying about a new study. A new study says 60% of cannabis and alcohol users say weed makes them drink less. So, should we legalise cannabis? Well, let's have a read of what he says. Would legalising cannabis lead to an overall reduction in substance-related harm? This is a tantalising prospect teased in a new study into whether cannabis is a substitute or complement for alcohol. 60% of those using both alcohol and cannabis said their cannabis use resulted in drinking less on a typical occasion and also drinking less frequently. The demographic groups are more likely to be among this group include Māori, 19% more likely than non-Māori, men, 14% more likely than women, and adults older than 21. A significant proportion also substituted cannabis for meth. 40% of co-users said using cannabis led to less meth consumption. The Massey University Associate Professor Chris Wilkins, co-author of the paper, said, if cannabis was legal, it wouldn't stop people drinking. It continues, but if, that's a big if, but if they reduced the quantity of alcohol they drank, that would be quite a considerable public health gain. Now, the article goes on to show the harms of drugs and note which one is causing the most harm. And not surprisingly, it's the legal one. Okay, so this is the graph that they showed, and it shows you the harms, and out the far left, the most harm comes from the legal one, alcohol. But if you go on the argument that legalising cannabis will lessen the harm, and I've circled that one in orange there, so it's about the 9th one from the left. If you go on that argument, then why don't we legalise cocaine and ecstasy? I've shown those two in the yellow circles. Because the harm is less. Well, that's their logic, but the logic in this argument is appalling. In fact, if you look out the right there, the least harm is done with no drugs. Wow, how unique. Who would have thought that? In fact, in this article, let's go back to the article, and once you get past the a very appealing grand title in the introductory text, you then actually get to some of the honesty of the article, and it says this. The researcher is quick to stress that it's much more complicated than simply legalising cannabis and then welcoming less overall drug harm. The paper didn't measure hazardous drug use, so it sheds no light on how much the substitution effect might reduce the most harmful alcohol or methamphetamine use. Nor does it have any insight into any potential increase in harmful cannabis use instead of the alcohol. The substitution effect is also far from universal. In the 16 to 20 age group, for example, some said their cannabis use led to less drinking, while for others, it led to more. Wilkins said it is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Now remember, this is halfway down a very long article. You might say, it goes on, you might say that if we legalise cannabis, we're going to get less alcohol use. This paper says that depends. If I'm an older adult and want to reduce my alcohol use, this could help, but in other groups, it's going to have the opposite effect. Nor is cannabis universally less harmful than alcohol or methamphetamine. A lot depends on an individual's genetics, physiology, and circumstance. Wow, there's a lot of admissions in this, isn't there? Wilkins says, say I've got pre-existing mental health problems or delinquency in adolescence, then this is not going to help me at all. It's quite tricky to realise those benefits depending on people's different life stages, different lifestyles and different ethnicities. It's hard to legalise cannabis for some people and not for others, or try and control unintended side effects. Wow, this article is getting weaker by the minute. And then keep reading and you find out even more dodgy stuff about the study. The paper is based on a 2020 online survey, which 2020, I mean, that's during COVID lockdown when a lot of people were sometimes turning to artificial substances. An online survey of 23,500 people interested in activities associated with drug use, including drinking. They were asked about their drug use. The most prevalent drug use used by respondents in the previous 6 months was alcohol, 87%, followed by cannabis, 68%, tobacco, 57%, MDMA, 45%, LSD, 26%, cocaine, 12%, meth, 7%. Wow. 68% using cannabis, 45% using ecstasy, 12% on cocaine, 7% on meth. Okay, this is not a normal population, is it? It's online, it's a drug community, the study has no control group, it's crappy research. In fact, I would say that probably half the respondents were referred by the Drug Foundation. These are hardcore drug users. But they're trying to make us think that legalising cannabis is going to somehow drive all these people from harder drugs. Well, in their dreams. The article concludes, there is currently no appetite from the government to revisit legalising cannabis, quite rightly, following the referendum. But the findings of the paper could be useful in other ways, says the author. You could try some experiments where you allowed people to get a prescription for medicinal cannabis, if it meant reducing the use of other more harmful drugs like meth, alcohol and opiates. Well, let me just quickly rebut that one. There was a study in Australia, a 20-year study. This is the one, a 20-year study out of Australia, and it was recently published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and it found no evidence to suggest cannabis reduces illicit opioid use, and it may not be an effective long-term method of reducing harm for those with an opioid use disorder or problematic use of opioids. But note the heading of the New Zealand Herald. Many people won't get past this heading. They won't read deep into the article, and that's, in my view, the intention of the New Zealand Herald. Slowly but surely sucking you in. And finally, our dear friends at One News. They were very concerned because they got some data and they said more Kiwis are facing charges for cannabis possession offences even after the police were directed 5 years ago not to prosecute unless it was in the public interest to do so. In 2019, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment was passed into law, giving police discretion on whether to prosecute when someone is found in possession of an illicit drug for personal use. Police were directed to consider whether prosecution is required in the public interest or if a health-centred approach would be more beneficial. And from the graph, it appears that the police do believe that prosecution is in the public interest. Now, Labour MP, who was the police spokesperson, Ginny Anderson, said the increase in prosecution doesn't seem fair. And, part of the issue was that 11 Vietnamese nationals were arrested and deported by Immigration New Zealand recently. They were busted for dealing cannabis. They had a total of more than 3,000 plants, 48 kg of dried buds in their rented homes in Auckland. The drugs seized were around $18 million. But the argument was that it's better and cheaper to boot them out of the country rather than put them in prison at the cost to the taxpayer, which, I don't know, sounds like a good decision to me. But Benedict Collins, the reporter from One News, doesn't quite understand it, and so filed this report.
The police cleaning up after the latest cannabis bust connected to Vietnamese criminal syndicates. 3,000 plants and 48 kilos of dried buds were found in Auckland rental homes, worth around $18 million.
Are highly organised. They're here for all the wrong reasons. The police are doing an outstanding job in terms of the investigations, identifying, charging, prosecuting. But in a case like this with the Vietnamese, where they're here as overstayers, it's actually much easier to put on a plane and send them home.
Yep.
11 Vietnamese connected to this latest bust were flown home, courtesy of the taxpayer, rather than facing punishment here.
Prison.
Well, I think that it's a big cost to the taxpayers here. It clogs up our justice system and our courts.
Are we becoming a bit of a holiday destination for these Vietnamese criminals who know that they don't face punishment and that we'll just, put them on a free flight and send them back?
No, I don't think so.
Cannabis.
I mean, this is quite funny because these reporters, media, would be the first ones to say, well, what are we punishing them for in the first place? And yet here they are now saying, oh, why didn't we punish them? I mean, you just can't win. Anyway, let's find out what our Green MP has to say.
It needs to be decriminalised legalised and regulated so that you don't get these kinds of outcomes where you have people coming to Aotearoa and being able to make a profit off of this.
One News wanted to ask the police why they let the Vietnamese crime group go, but they refused to be interviewed for this story. At the same time, police are again ramping up charges against New Zealanders for possessing minor amounts of pot. That's despite a government directive in 2019 to only charge drug users if it was in the public interest. That year, there were more than 2,100 charges laid for possessing cannabis. But after the public interest direction, charges for possessing pot fell right away. Now, they're rising steeply again.
Good.
It doesn't seem fair that there's an increase in low-level cannabis offending for New Zealanders, but international criminals operating on a large scale are simply being let off the hook.
The police willing to put small-scale local cannabis offenders through the courts, but not wanting to burden them with the big dealers.
Well, at least the Green MP admits what the real agenda is, decriminalisation, legalisation, let's just have it all. But what One News and Ginny Anderson and other drug activists never acknowledge is that all the research shows that most convictions are not for minor drug possession per se. It's for drug-related offences, that is, crimes committed while on drugs, murder, armed robbery, theft, assault, child abuse, or crimes committed in order to obtain drugs, or for dealing drugs, any amount of drugs, and putting our families and communities at risk. If that line in the graph has to continue to go up to protect families, well, so be it. Good. New Zealand made a great decision in 2020 by voting no to legalise cannabis, despite the ongoing wailing of the media, drug advocates and certain politicians. But don't expect the media or the drug activists to go quiet on this issue any time soon. And neither will we.